Kim, and I am the Child Development Specialist here at LAMP Early On. Today, we are going to be taking a look at hypersensitivity and some very general basic strategies you can use if your little one is hypersensitive or over-responsive to sensory stimulus. So let's just get started. So before we get into exploring the different types of hypersensitivity and just some easy, simple things that you can do at home to kind of mitigate the hypersensitivity of sensory stimuli that your child may be experiencing, we are going to go through what sensory hypersensitivity is, what sensory overload is, and then just touching upon the different types. So being hypersensitive or oversensitive to sensory stimuli is when it's just like in the name, your child is very sensitive to certain sensory stimulus, and maybe your child even goes out of their way to avoid certain sensations that are too overwhelming for them. And when it's too overwhelming, it just could mean that their brain is being overloaded and bombarded with sensory information. It could be that it hurts, like it physically hurts them, whether it be the lights or the sounds and stuff like that. When your child is experiencing sensory overload, that can just mean that your child's brain has so much sensory input that it can't process anymore, and that usually leads to meltdowns or your child trying to remove themselves from certain situations, which is just their flight or their fight response. And this is because their brain can't cope with the influx of information. So things that they can do is tantrums and meltdowns. They can run away from the situation, or they can just freeze and shut down and become unresponsive. So throughout the video, we're going to be focusing on the hypersensitivity and what it may look like for children with ASD. However, this isn't an exclusive list. There's a lot more information out there, as well as not every child with ASD will experience this, just like not every child who experienced this has ASD. If you do have any questions or concerns, feel free to email me or ask your pediatrician as well. But moving on, we're going to still talk about sensory overload and some signs and indicators that your child might be approaching sensory overload, so you can see. So changes in their voice, which could include going either quiet or talking more or loudly, so it changes in their pitch, their volume, or the pace in which they are talking. Their movement can change, so either they're increasing or decreasing in movement. Some children might actually become more tense, others might just become more fidgety. Sometimes their skin color can actually change. They can either go red or pale, which indicates that there's an increase in body temperature. And then change in focus or attention. So usually this can also include the lack of attention or focus all of a sudden. They could be checked out, they could be daydreaming, it really depends. They could request to leave if they're talking, or to know when something is finished. So this is more of a regulation strategy. When they're becoming overwhelmed, some might go and leave the situation or whatever, the environment that's overstimulating them. So it's useful to consider why your little one is asking to leave or why they want to know when something is done. Again, tantrums, outbursts, anger, lashing out or biting as well. And the biting and the lashing out are more common in nonverbal children, as there's no way for them to actually request to leave or to have something to stop. And then finally, when they run away or hide. So when we talk about sensory, we talk about sight, sound, smell, touch, but we also talk about balance and body awareness. So balance and body awareness are things like the vestibular sensory and the proprioceptive sensory are the other names for balance and body awareness. So those are the things that we are going to be touching on today throughout this video about what it looks like in hypersensitivity, and then as well some strategies that you can use at home. So we are going to start with hearing or the auditory sensory. So those that are sensitive to auditory, it's really more when a child experiences sensitivity to certain sounds or to certain frequencies. Often they will notice sounds or audio in their environment that we might not, or that our brain will try to ignore. So typically their brain perceives these audio sensory sensations more intensely than others. And because of this, noise sensitivity can lead to sensory or auditory overload. So those who experience auditory sensitivity might be sensitive to certain sounds, but not to others. They might overreact to sound or avoid noisy places and activities. And others might find filtering out background noise more difficult than others to do. So again, we talked about sensory overload. So if it's a noisy environment, for us, I think our brains just naturally filter out those background noises. But for those who are hypersensitive to sound and audio, they might not be able to do that as easily as us, which might create sensory overload. And what can cause those sensitivities? It can be for a number of reasons. It might be because of a medical condition. It might be because of the structure of the ear itself. There's no actual medical reason to explain auditory sensitivity. It's just what the brain has developed and what our brain has chosen to focus on more. And you'll notice too that sometimes your child might say that hearing certain sounds or certain frequencies are painful. So these sounds can include things like hand dryers, vacuum cleaners, washing machines. And this is because their amygdala, which is a part of the brain which takes in sensory information, responds differently. So it can perceive sound with higher intensity. And this leads to overload, which then allows the brain to become overloaded by the intensity of the sound. But like I said, every child, every person is different. So the sound one person finds challenging won't necessarily be the same as another. And often each child will have a pattern in the frequency or type of sound that they find more challenging. And as they age and as their brain develops, you'll notice that their sensitivity to certain sensory stimuli will also change as well. So next we're going to go on to the tactile or sense of touch. And tactile hypersensitivity is when they're very sensitive to touch, and they might be more bothered by things that touch their skin than others. So these tactile sensitivity can occur with food textures, with clothing or fabric textures, self-care tasks, or when they receive a hug or a kiss. It can also be with specific items, like messy play, pencils, or paper. Individuals who are sensitive to touch may respond by avoiding sensations or having a bigger reaction than you might expect from others. So, for example, they might refuse to wear socks with seams because the seam or the texture of the sock irritates their skin. So, just like in the last one, some children will and adults will say that it hurts. It hurts too much when things are very sensitive to touch. So they might be bothered by the feeling of certain fabrics or clothing textures. Like I mentioned earlier, they might dislike socks, especially around the seam or if there's tags. Difficulty with wearing shoes. They might hate messy textures like Play-Doh, glue, finger paint. If you're baking and cooking the dough, sometimes they'll also hate the dry textures like sand. They have sensitivity or pickiness with food textures, including avoidance of mixed textures like lasagna or foods with some lumps with it, like those yogurt parfaits. They have an aversion to touch, such as hugs or kisses. They have difficulty with teeth brushing, difficulty with haircuts and hair brushings, super sensitive to touch when cutting fingers or toenails, and they really dislike or are bothered by clothing tags. And I'm going to breeze through this one because we touched upon it in the tactile sensitivity or the touch sensitivity. But with oral sensitivity, like I mentioned earlier, it could be things like food textures, and but it can also include food flavors, spices, and all that stuff. With sight, again, this one is pretty self-explanatory. Sight sensitivity could be things like being overloaded with information on the actual lighting in the room or how much visual stimuli that they are being bombarded with at home. So if there's too much color in the room, it could be they could be hypersensitive. If the lights are too bright or if they're fluorescent, then that can also bother them a lot too. And just like the other ones, some children do say that they experience pain when they are hypersensitive to sights and visuals. So now in terms of the vestibular and the proprioceptive sensory overload. So children with vestibular hypersensitivity or sensitivity to balance, they have difficulty in walking or running on non-smooth or uneven surfaces, as well as in changing directions. So they have difficulty with their balance and with uneven surfaces. And for individuals with proprioceptive sensory sensitivity or body awareness, they can have a different type of stance or a gait, as well as they have difficulty manipulating small objects or so difficulties with their fine motor skills. So now we're going to look into some strategies that you can use at home to help. So like I mentioned with the visual sensitivity, either dimming the lights or changing the fluorescent light bulbs into a more natural light one can really help. If they're very hypersensitive to sight, and they get easily distracted by visuals, something as simple as closing the door can really help, or being in a room that has high walls to block out distracting sights and sounds, so that they're in a more quieter, calmer area so that they can focus a little bit more. if they have tactile or touch sensitivity, to remove the tags off of clothes, off of socks. Another thing for those who are sensitive to touch, asking them permission before you touch their arm or give them a hug so that you warn them. Wearing sunglasses or a visor to block overhead fluorescent lighting if you cannot change the lighting in your area, as well as wearing earplugs or headphones in noisy environments so that it blocks out the sounds, and they can concentrate a little bit better. And then for the tactile and oral sensitive child, these are rubber massage brushes. So sometimes if your child has difficulty eating due to the texture of the food, so tactile, rubber massage brushes can actually desensitize the mouth and help fix those, will desensitize them over time, and this might make it easier for your child to try different foods or to actually get them to brush their teeth on their own. These chew tubes are usually for children that are hyposensitive, so they're undersensitive, and we'll talk about that next week. However, these are also great to use with children who are hypersensitive to help develop their biting skills. And these weighted blankets are great. So weighted blankets really kind of give that even pressure, and it's just great for children to kind of provide that deep touch pressure, which is proven to release serotonin, and it creates a calm, relaxing sensation. These blankets are great for calming children after a meltdown, after during sensory overload, or to help them fall asleep. Some other examples of deep touch pressure are these weighted vests, and the constant and even pressure from this vest helps provide some sensory stability, and this is also great to calm down after a sensory overload, but again, next week we'll talk about this. But these vests are also great for children who love hugging or squishing things and are restless. But again, like I said, these pressure vests have a calming effect and can actually improve concentration while worn, because sometimes those who are hypersensitive to sensory stimuli, they also say that they have the sensation that they're floating. So these are just some great ways to keep them a little bit more grounded. Another example of this are some weighted toys, plush toys. This is a bear, but there's also snakes. There's many different ones out there, and they provide the same comfort and the same thing. So we also talk about heavy work, and heavy work is really great for those who have a sensory sensitivity to their body awareness, so proprioception. And heavy work is really things that can move their body in any way, and it's things like digging and pouring with sandpit or a water tray, rolling out and cutting Play-Doh, resistant band exercises, pushing a trolley or a cart or a wheelbarrow, carrying a bag with a little bit of weight, tug of war, all this fun stuff. Rock climbing, swimming is another good one, gardening. These are all great heavy work examples, and they're great for your not only just your balance, but the body awareness as well if they are being hypersensitive. Yoga is another great one for children who are experiencing sensory hypersensitivity. So yoga and breathing are really great ways. And this just works on their deep breathing, can calm them down, and it kind of just reorganizes the brain, these deep breathing exercises as well. And then some other things that you can do at home or avoid tickling. Sometimes children with touch sensitivity will laugh when they're tickled, but watch that it's not a nervous laugh, indicating that they're uncomfortable. Oral activities can also help with regulation, particularly the chewing and the sucking. So like I mentioned before, those chew tubes are really good, or getting them to chew something a little bit more sticky if they're comfortable with that. Other things you can do to promote balance are balance beams, and then trampolines as well, and as well as these like the bead sequencing set, or the things where you have to kind of string on to the beads or puzzles, as they are a great way to work on the fine motor skills, which will work on their body awareness sensitivity as well. Also, some things to look out for is your environment. So considering your environment, your home is the most predictable and easiest thing to manage, and it's the place where your child is in the most these days. So look at your space. If you notice that your child is sensitive to visuals or to sounds, try and think of maybe like a quiet or safe space for your child if they get overwhelmed. Notice the lights or all the colors in the room if there's a lot in there as well. And then just also keeping in mind that the responses can change as they grow up, like I mentioned. So maybe one day your child is sensitive to lights, and then the next it's no longer the lights that bother them, it's a lot of the colors that are around the room too. So now we're going to talk about some ways professionals can help with your little one and try to overcome some of these sensory hypersensitivities. So occupational therapy is great because they use physical activities and strategies to help each child meet their sensory needs, and also help them better process sensory input in their everyday environment. And speech therapy is great because it includes both sensitivity reducing and sensory stimulating activities that improve speech, swallowing, and related muscle movements around the mouth area. So these are just some of the things that you can do at home, and a couple of the professionals that can help you as well. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found this video very informative. If you had any questions around this or around any other child development topic, please email me. My email is always in the description box below. Follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And I will see you all next time. Goodbye, everyone.